Hello everyone, and welcome to Part 4, Errors and Exceptions. Oftentimes, our code isn't going to be perfect, meaning we run into errors. And I'm sure by now you've actually ran into your own errors while trying to code out some of the examples in this course. But you may be wondering also, how do we actually set up our own error and exception calls? Let's find out. The key to all of this are these three keywords: try, except, and finally. We can use them to dictate our code logic in case of an error. To show how this works, we're going to be opening files, and one way to open files is to use the open function. And the open function looks like this as a general example, where your first parameter is the actual file or path to the file, and the second parameter is a string code, indicating whether you're just going to be reading the file, writing to the file, or reading and writing to the file. So as I mentioned, that second parameter dictates how you're going to be opening the file. And if you accidentally use the wrong code, for instance, you say you're just going to read the file and then you attempt to write on the file, you may get an error. So we're going to be using this open function to actually show how we can handle errors. Let's hop over to the editor and get started. Okay, so here I am at the editor. To begin with, let's actually show what happens when we make a mistake and actually get an error out. So for instance, let's say I say print here and I say hello, but for some reason I accidentally cut off that last single quote and messed up. If I try to run this notes.py file, saying python notes.py, and I hit enter, I get a syntax error, and it's EOL, or end of line, while scanning string literal, meaning the line suddenly ended and it expected more here. So that's one type of error you get. Notice it's called syntax error. Now let's say I do another error, where I say something like print my list. And for some reason, I forgot to define my list, or maybe I defined my list earlier, but I called it my list here. Set it equal to 1, 2, 3, and later on in my code, I forgot it was my list here, and I just said my list. Let's save this and run this. No, I get another error. This one's called name error, saying the name my list is not defined. And basically what this means is that we get these specific errors that are trying to help us out actually figure out what's wrong with our code. And this type of error in description is known as an exception. Even if a statement or expression is syntactically correct, it may cause an error when an attempt is made to actually execute that specific command. Errors detected during execution are called exceptions, and they're actually not unconditionally fatal. And what I mean by the phrase unconditionally fatal is that you can use those three keywords we talked about earlier to actually dictate how your code can handle those errors or exceptions and continue on with the rest of the script. That way, if something pops up, you can actually move with the punches and keep going. So let's show you how to use try and except. The basic terminology and syntax used to handle errors are try, except, and sometimes finally statements. Basically, it's code which can cause an exception is put inside the try block, and the handling of that exception is implemented in the except block of code. Let me copy and paste the example syntax from the notes to show you. So I'm going to copy and paste some commented code here. Let's say Control V, there we go. So the general syntax looks like this. You have a try, and you do your operations inside this try statement. And like the keyword kind of implies, you're going to try to do this. You're going to attempt to do it. And then you have except and exception 1. So if there's exception 1, and this exception 1 would be something like this, name error or syntax error. So you're kind of watching for a specific exception. Then you execute some certain block of code. Then you can have another except if there's an exception 2. So that's maybe one check is for a syntax error, another check is for a name error, etc. Then you execute this block. And then else, if there is no exception, you execute that block. So we can better understand this by actually walking through an example. Let me delete all this, and inside of this same folder, I'm going to create a new file. It's going to be a simple text file. We'll say simple txt, and it just says hello world. This is just a normal text file. Save that. And then inside of notes.py, I'm going to try to open this file. So I will say try, and I will say f is equal to open, and we'll pass in simple txt, that's simple text. Now I'm going to open it with the parameter w as my second argument. And then I'm going to write. So I will say test write to simple text. And then I'm going to say except, and I will specify except IO error, which is an import output or input output operation error. And this will only check for an IO error exception and then execute a certain block of code. So let's print error could not find file or read data. And then finally we'll say else, and I will print success. And then finally we need to close that file. So the basics of working with a file is you open it, you either read or write it, and then you close it. So let's actually run this and see what happens. So I'll call python notes.py, and it looks like it was a success, so everything's working well. Now let's see what happens if I accidentally, instead of saying with W for write, I said R, which stands for read. And when you open a file with only R, that means you only have reading permissions on that file. You can't write to the file. And what's useful about only saying R is if you want to make sure your code doesn't accidentally write over a file, you make sure to only open it with the R permissions, meaning you can only read it. That way, if you accidentally write to the file, it won't happen. You'll get some sort of error. So let's clear the console and run that. And note here, instead of getting that sort of IO error, I get this, error, could not find file or read data. And that's how this except works. Except can look for a specific error, and then instead of actually outputting what the error would usually output and stopping all your code, it prints error could not find file or read data, and then we can have an else statement. And then we can actually keep going. So let's say I have something outside of this that says print hello world, save that, run Python notes again. It says error could not find file or read data, hello world. So what this try except clause actually helps you do is handle errors and then continue on with your code. Let's imagine that I didn't actually use try, that I just tried to do this without this sort of block. So I comment all that out, and then I just say fopen simple text, I say fwrite, and then if I scroll all the way down, let's say after doing that, I try to print hello world. If I save this and run this, I get back this IO error, not writable, and I never actually output print hello world. This was fatal to my actual .py file. And the way we can use try and except is to make these sort of exceptions not unconditionally fatal, meaning having your code being able to handle these sort of unexpected, or in this case, expected errors and continue on. And that's really the whole point of this. If you expect something wrong may occur, or you have a certain condition that may actually mess up your code, you can counter it with an except clause. Now, another thing you may be wondering is, well, how am I supposed to know what error is going to happen? I can't have all these error codes memorized. You know the basic one, like syntax error or name error, but you may not have known IO error or other errors. What you can do is you actually don't need to give any error code. If you just have a general except here, it's going to print on any sort of error. So let's save this and run this again. Python notes.py. It'll report back on error. So you don't actually need to specify the specific error. So a lot of times you're just going to be writing except there. Okay, so now let's introduce the finally keyword. And the finally key block of code will always be run regardless if there's an exception in the try code block. So right now, if you look at our code structure, we have try, which tries to do something, except, which is going to report back this block of code if there's an error here. And then we have the else, meaning if we don't actually have that exception, we'll say else, print success, and then fclose. But what if we actually get an error, but want to continue doing stuff inside of a block of code here? So instead of having like print hello world out here, what we can do is have the finally keyword. So I will add in a finally block, and then I'm going to say print I always work, no matter what. And then let's save this and run this. And we see here, even though we got an error, we always get the finally block to occur. So I always work no matter what. Okay, that's really all we need to know for now about try, except, and finally. As a quick note, these try blocks are not invulnerable to all errors. If you have an error that affects the try block itself, so for instance, if I close this off and I have the try block continuing on, I'm going to get an error here. So if I save this and then try something like python notes.py, I will get here a syntax error. And it's not caught by this except statement because the error is actually affecting the try except finally statement itself. So it thinks that all of this belongs to this string and you have some sort of syntax error there. So except is actually being messed up there. So again, you don't actually usually use try for something like a simple syntax mistake. You use it for larger blocks of code that are usually interacted with some sort of user input. That way you can handle any user mistakes that happen to affect your code. Again, the keywords to know here are try, except, and finally. Where you're going to try to execute some block of code, you'll say except to try to catch certain exceptions, and a lot of times you're going to catch certain exceptions and print out something that's more useful than just syntax error, invalid syntax. Something useful like, hey, you had an error doing this specific operation, check this out, maybe review this line of code, etc. And then you have the finally block, which always works even if there's an exception. Okay, thanks everyone, and I'll see you at the next lecture.